faces here, so I just want to introduce myself. My name is Charles Small. I'm the director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Antisemitism. We run a seminar series, and this evening is a special seminar we usually have in the afternoon, but tonight we're having it at 7 o'clock, in part because Hillel, Neuer, and I were in New York City today, where Hillel launched his report today on the United Nations and Antisemitism, and he'll be speaking about that, as you know, tonight. So very briefly, Hillel is a fellow Montrealer. We're both originally from Montreal and hung out at the Hillel Student Society a couple of decades ago together. Hillel took over as the director of UN Watch, which is based in Geneva, in 2004. He left private law practice to take up the issues of monitoring the United Nations. And basically, the UN Watch monitors the UN based on their own guidelines, mission, and criteria, and takes them to task on several issues concerning human rights, and obviously anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel is just one issue that they take up. Hillel graduated from Concordia University in political science. He has a BCL and an LLB degree in law from McGill University, and then he went on to do an LLM, or a master's degree, at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And it's a particular privilege and pleasure to have Hillel speak to us tonight on the United Nations and issues of anti-Semitism.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to the Yale Initiative for hosting me this evening to present a new report. We have copies in the trunk of a car somewhere. And those who are interested can approach Charles and tell you our report is called United Nations and Antisemitism. It was released a few hours ago in New York City, and we released it here at Yale University. And it has also on the internet worldwide release and is being reported in the press as we speak. I'm delighted to see Caroline Gross, a former colleague from UN Watch, who's a fellow with us, and actually wrote the first draft of this report before she became a student here at Yale Law School. Anything you like in the report, you can thank Caroline. And if it's something that you disagree with or you think is a mistake, I will take all the blame. Anti-Semitism is rising. We look at the statistics issued recently by the Tel Aviv University's Stephen Roth Institute. It measures anti-Semitism. We see such statistics as, since 1989, anti-Semitic attacks have risen sharply, reaching their highest point in 16 years in 2006. The issue of anti-Semitism is urgent, it is global, and the question is, what is the UN, as the world's premier global agency, doing about it? In June 2004, the United Nations held an historic gathering for the first time ever on anti-Semitism. Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the United Nations, delivered remarks that were both candid and profound. And I'd like to share with you some of those remarks, which we feature in our report in their entirety. In June 2004, UN headquarters, gathering on anti-Semitism. And he said, and I quote, "Anti-Semitism has been a unique manifestation of hatred, intolerance, and persecution, a harbinger of discrimination against others. The rise of anti-Semitism anywhere is a threat to people everywhere. In fighting anti-Semitism, we fight for the future of all humanity." Mr. Annan went on to say that the Holocaust was the epitome of this evil. Where 6 million innocent Jewish men, women, and children were murdered just because they were Jews. That is a crime against humanity which defies imagination. He went on to say that the name United Nations was coined to describe the alliance fighting to end that barbarous regime. And our organization came into being when the world had just learned the full horror of concentration and extermination camps. It is therefore rightly said that the United Nations emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust. And the human rights agenda, he said, that fails to address anti-Semitism denies its own history. He went on to call upon leading UN agencies and officials to take action and confront anti-Semitism. Not only did he address the classic acts of anti-Semitism against individual Jews, he also addressed the issue of the United Nations, and not only the United Nations' role in the fight against anti-Semitism, but he also acknowledged the UN's potential role, and indeed its actual role at certain times, in contributing to anti-Semitism. And he said as follows, quote, "Let us acknowledge that the United Nations' record on anti-Semitism has at times fallen short of our ideals. The General Assembly Resolution of 1975, equating Zionism with racism, was an especially unfortunate decision. I am glad that it has since been rescinded." This was Kofi Annan in June 2004, and he ended his remarks by saying, "We look to our friends in civil society to keep us to the mark." And UN Watch is a non-governmental organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, presents this report today, which I will summarize for you, to hold the UN accountable to keep it to the mark. What has the UN done since June 2004 on this issue? Has it lived up to its promise? This is the first time that any NGO has released a report of this kind since June 2004, measuring exactly what the UN has done. We don't claim to be comprehensive, examining every UN action, but this is a wide-ranging survey of key actions in the past 3 years. And I'd like to begin by noting noteworthy advances. This is not a report that is here to say that the UN is anti-Semitic and everything is bad. On the contrary, there are noteworthy advances. I'd like to begin with those. Under the leadership of Kofi Annan, there were several noteworthy advances. He indeed followed up his commitment with action. And most notably, we saw following June 2004 a series of important UN gatherings and initiatives and undertakings, particularly on Holocaust commemoration. The Holocaust was the epitome of anti-Semitism, and events that teach the world about the Holocaust, that commemorate the Holocaust, are by definition actions that counter anti-Semitism, that teach the lesson of how the Holocaust came to be. Moreover, with Holocaust denial as one of the classic manifestations of anti-Semitism today, led by President Ahmadinejad of Iran. Anything that teaches, educates about the Holocaust is, in essence, a form of countering Holocaust denial and therefore countering anti-Semitism. And what we saw, I would say, 3 key actions by the UN since June 2004 on this issue. There was the historic special session in January 2005 that commemorated 60 years since the liberation of the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz. And this was a major event in January 2005. It was attended by leading foreign ministers, including Joschka Fischer of Germany, Elie Wiesel, Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor, spoke, as did Mr. Annan and others. Kofi Annan was eloquent, speaking how the United Nations must never forget that it was created as a response to the evil of Nazism. And that response is enshrined in our Charter and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Kofi Annan went on to say that, as Elie Wiesel has written, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. It was a very powerful day. And the first time the United Nations had ever done anything remotely similar in addressing the Holocaust. That day passed, but a few months later, it was followed up with another resolution that enshrined an annual day of Holocaust commemoration. To be honest, I was cynical, I was skeptical. I didn't think that the UN would handle this properly. There's a fear sometimes that you want the UN to do something, but then you give it the mandate, and the folks who have the power to execute that mandate may not be so friendly to the cause and may may undertake it on their own terms. But I have to say, in the past 2 years, Holocaust commemoration activities held in New York City and in Geneva, which is the European headquarters of the United Nations, were meaningful and significant. And we saw Holocaust survivor Simone Weil from Europe come and address the General Assembly, and a series of other important events. And all of these are meaningful. All of these are meaningful. You know, UN resolutions count. What the UN says counts. In America, there are many people who think the UN is silly, and what they say is nonsense. But the truth is, we talk about it in our report, that the United Nations is the leading forum of international legitimacy. That's how it's regarded around the world. As U.S. Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick wrote, UN resolutions define world opinion on major issues. Global polls taken show that the UN surpasses many other leading institutions in society for the trust level that they have around the world, coming second perhaps only after NGOs. And so what the UN says counts. Its pronouncements are translated in every official language and broadcast around the world. So when the UN speaks against anti-Semitism, when it speaks against the Holocaust, this matters. In addition to the annual Holocaust commemoration, there's also a Holocaust education program, which is doing important things. Just a few days ago, they announced an initiative with Yad Vashem, Israel's National Holocaust Museum, to train information officers throughout the world working for the United Nations to learn more about the Holocaust so they too can educate others. All of this is important, and all of these are noteworthy advances that followed the June 2004 session on anti-Semitism. We also saw that in a series of resolutions on religious intolerance and on racism, that anti-Semitism was for the first time mentioned, where they were never referenced before. For example, on religious intolerance in 2004, anti-Semitism for the first time was referenced. And as I said, these resolutions count. It also sends a message to UN officials throughout the institution that the issue is serious and that they should act on it. In a moment, I'll give you an example. I should say, of course, that not all these resolutions were adopted so easily. The resolutions that reference anti-Semitism were fought repeatedly by the Islamic states, the bloc of 56 countries, the Organization of the Islamic Conference at the UN, and they have repeatedly fought any reference to anti-Semitism. That's unfortunate. And then further on, I'll come to some other campaigns that the Islamic group has been waging, which is hostile to the fight against anti-Semitism, undermines the fight against anti-Semitism. So to summarize noteworthy advances, we have a series of actions for Holocaust commemoration. We also have resolutions referencing anti-Semitism. Those are noteworthy advances. Other actions by other officials were mixed grades, if this is a report card. We have the experts on racism and religious intolerance. Kofi Annan specifically appealed to them and urged them to take action on anti-Semitism. The racism expert is Dudu Dien, is his name, and he deserves credit for courage in resisting efforts by the Islamic group to curtail his ability to address anti-Semitism. The Islamic group passed a resolution saying that he could only investigate actions against Muslims and the defamation of Islam. It's a common theme throughout the UN that Islam has been defamed, follows the Danish cartoons controversy, and there are repeated UN resolutions generating reports about the so-called defamation of Islam. And so the racism expert was charged with reporting only on Islamophobia, but he had the courage to expand his purview and to include also acts of hatred against Jews and Christians as well. And one of the things he cited was not only Kofi Annan's seminar of June 2004, but also the resolution on religious intolerance, which he said referenced anti-Semitism, and therefore he argued he had a mandate to address it. And so he deserves credit for that. He also deserves credit for confronting Iran. When President Ahmadinejad denied the Holocaust and incited to the destruction of Israel, as he has done repeatedly, in one international forum after another, and this is not a mistranslation, as some have said, he's had many opportunities to clarify, and time and again, he's called the Holocaust a myth, and one form or another was called for wiping Israel off the map. Well, Dudu Dien, the UN expert on racism, confronted Iran in one of his reports to the Human Rights Council, and he made Iran answer for its crimes. Iran was forced to answer for the Human Rights Council, it was morally forced. It was not physically compelled to do so, but because the expert on racism raised it in an international forum, Iran felt it had to answer. And it gave one ridiculous answer after another, but it had to answer because the UN expert raised it, and so it's important. For all of this, we give him credit. At the same time, we gave him mixed grades because sometimes in some of his reports, he's relied on expertise that we might call dubious expertise in some of his reports. I'll give you just one example, primary example. Some 6 weeks ago in Geneva, a newspaper called the GHI, which is sort of distributed free, but widely distributed in Geneva, saw the following article, which talks about a new book by a woman named Esther Benbassa. She's a French academic. And she wrote a book called La souffrance comme identité. And she argues that Jews have been falsely creating suffering as an identity, and that in Europe, in fact, although Jews claim to have had a tearful history in Europe, she says that this is a misrepresentation. In fact, Jews have had a privileged existence in Europe. I haven't read the book, but this is a whole spread about this book saying, in fact, Jews have had a really fun ride in their 2,000 years in Europe. And I don't know exactly how she addressed the various burnings and expulsions in all various cities in Europe over centuries leading up to the Holocaust. But that's her book. She is apparently Jewish. And this gave a very wide spread. And then on the side of the article about her book is other stories that are portray Jews in a negative light. There's one about the World Jewish Congress, some nasty things about them, and then about the Khmelnytsky massacres in Ukraine, saying how, in fact, it wasn't Jews who were the victims, but others, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of a whole spread which is borderline anti-Semitic and cites this woman, Esther Benbassa. Now, when Dudu Dienne had a seminar on racism and anti-Semitism, one of the main experts that he relies on, experts on anti-Semitism, is Esther Benbassa. And indeed, he comes to the conclusion in his report that, among other things, is critical of some of the leading advocates of anti-Semitism. So you have an event and a report meant to address anti-Semitism, and one of the top authorities that he relies on is a woman whose main oeuvre is fighting the advocates who fight against anti-Semitism and saying that it's exaggerated, and so on and so forth. So all of this is cause for concern, and that is a problem, as I said, when some UN officials take on something, they do it on their own terms, and they'll find people who they want to cite and pursue it in the way that they want to. So that's a problem. The UN expert on religious intolerance is Asma Jahangir. She has raised anti-Semitism in a mission to France, a country that is, of course, a place that has witnessed a rise in anti-Semitism in recent years. That was good. Unfortunately, on other issues, for example, textbooks in the Middle East, in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which have documented, which teach children hatred for all non-Muslims, Christians and Jews. When this issue was raised by several NGOs and hundreds of people who wrote petitions online and asked her to take action, she did make some reference to it in the plenary of the Council in one of her reports, but it was really a passing reference, and we're not aware that she's actually confronted Egypt and Saudi Arabia for teaching hatred to millions and millions of children. And if we want hope for a new Middle East, it has to begin with the textbooks, and unfortunately we haven't seen real action from her on this issue, and we hope that she takes action. So we have some UN officials mixed grades. Okay, thank you. So we started with noteworthy advances, looked at some who got mixed grades. Now we come to inaction. Inaction. There are several UN officials who, regrettably, we found in our report inaction on their part. One of them is the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Louise Arbour. Now, when Kofi Annan had his call to action in June 2004, he said, quote, "A human rights agenda that fails to address anti-Semitism denies its own history." The leader of the human rights agenda is the High Commissioner. High Commissioner for Human Rights, Louise Arbour. She oversees the UN's efforts to protect human rights and to combat racism. She is, just recently, for example, appointed the Secretary General of the Durban Review Process. You know of the Durban 2001 Conference Against Racism. It was meant to be against racism. There's a new process called the Durban Review Process, and The chair is Libya, is chairing the process. Libya, of course, chaired the Commission on Human Rights in 2003, and in August, just a couple months ago, in Geneva, Libya was elected to chair, and Louise Arbour was appointed as Secretary General. So her role is very important on these issues, and in our survey, in our analysis of her actions, we were unable to find, since she took office in 2004 until today, any noteworthy action on anti-Semitism. We searched and we could not find, maybe we missed something, but we couldn't find anything. We wrote to them, wrote to the Office of the High Commissioner asking for a list of any actions that Madame Arbour took or her colleagues. We got no response. We wrote again, we got no response. We called twice, we got no response. So to the best of our knowledge, we're unable to find any action whatsoever by the High Commissioner for Human Rights and Anti-Semitism. This includes actions about Ahmadinejad, which, as I said, a number of UN agencies and officials spoke out. Kofi Annan, several times, condemned Ahmadinejad's denial of the Holocaust and incitement to genocide. The new Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, has done the same and deserves credit for that. The Security Council has spoken out. The General Assembly condemned Holocaust denial a few days after Ahmadinejad organized a Holocaust denial conference in Tehran. Unfortunately, when 40 NGOs in January 2007, January 29, 2007, a group of over 40 NGOs, including Human Rights First, Freedom House, Democracy Coalition Project, the Darfur Relief Center, Methodist Church, and others, including Human Watch, asked the High Commissioner to use the occasion of the annual Holocaust Commemoration Day to condemn denials of the Holocaust by Iran. One of the outrages cited by our NGO coalition was a letter submitted by the mission of Iran to the Human Rights Council, by Iran's envoy to the Human Rights Council, an official letter that was circulated as a UN document justifying the Holocaust denial conference and calling into question the Holocaust itself. This obscene letter was circulated to all governments. It actually was done so by the Office of the High Commissioner, not because they were being malicious, but because that's just the protocol. But when we asked that this, among other things, be addressed, we got no response. This is a matter of deep concern, and I have no explanation for it. We did, on occasion, get a few responses, UN Watch and others, of private letters expressing concern. For example, in 2005, on this issue, Madame Arbour was approached, and she did write back a private letter to UN Watch and its coalition, which included the Anglican Church, Socialist International Women, and others. And she wrote back saying that she endorsed a statement by the Secretary General of 27 October 2005. This is a weak, you write a private letter, it's not a public statement, but a private letter, and in the private letter you don't even say, I condemn the President of Iran for denying the Holocaust, but say, by reference, implicitly, I support such and such a statement. It's the difference between calling someone a murderer and saying, I call you the word that's found on page 895 of the dictionary, of the Oxford edition, the concise Oxford dictionary. So, at the UN there are levels of condemnation, and every government knows it. In diplomacy there's a whole language, and governments are very attuned to the statements that are made. And so, when governments see that the public denial of the Holocaust, incitement to genocide, which is the ultimate violation of human rights, when all of this is answered by public silence and by private letters that are at best implicit, this sends a message. And the UN holds the pulpit that, as I said, is valued around the world, and the highest pulpit of human rights, the High Commissioner, needs to speak up. And so we're concerned that we haven't seen any action on anti-Semitism. We're also concerned that the representative of the High Commissioner in New York City, Mr. Craig McIver, when he attended a UN event about genocide and the Holocaust, when he was asked if he would address, Ahmadinejad was about to come, this is in 2006, Ahmadinejad was about to come to the UN, and he was asked by a member of the audience what he had to say about Ahmadinejad and genocide, and one of the panelists gave a long, very substantial response, very directly condemning Ahmadinejad and saying how the conjunction of calls for genocide and nuclear weapons were a serious matter requiring all the world's attention. That was by Dr. Hamburg, the UN expert on genocide, advisor to Kofi Annan. But then when Craig McIver, the representative of the High Commissioner, was asked, he refused to address it. He said, it's not something that he would address. His quote was, "I probably did not understand that question at all." And then at the end of his remarks, he actually, in effect, admonished the person who asked the question, and then compared the government of Sudan. He said, all governments commit violations: the government of Sudan, the government of Iran, the government of Israel, the government of the United States. So equating governments that either commit genocide or incite genocide to those that have been the target of that incitement. So again, all this is a matter of deep concern. So as I said, it's an example of inaction at the United Nations, and we should be especially concerned now that the Durban review process is coming up. Next category, after inaction, unfortunately, is obstruction of action. There are also, at the United Nations, we find instances where action against anti-Semitism is undermined. And you folks get our report. It's available online on our website, www.unwatch.org. You can find our report, and if you look at page 39 of our report, you will find that there is a campaign at the United Nations, which you may not have known about, by member states to redefine anti-Semitism. Let me tell you what happened just 2 months ago in Geneva. When I was at the Human Rights Council, I heard the ambassador of Pakistan, Masood Khan, speaking on behalf of the 56-strong Organization of the Islamic Conference, and he said as follows: "A cruel form of anti-Semitism is Islamophobia." Moments later, Algeria said, quote, "A worrying upswing in anti-Semitism now targets Arabs and is extended by oversimplification to all Muslims." So anti-Semitism is not against Jews. It may be against Jews, but it's also against Arabs, it's also against Muslims. This may sound silly and absurd, but in fact it's only the latest salvos of a long-standing campaign at the UN to define away the term of hatred for Jews. This is about corroding language and ideas and concepts, to just define away the term for hatred of Jews. And this campaign is waged by the very states who have the most to answer for. Now, of course, all this is nonsense. The word Semites is a classification of language, not of race or nationality. Anti-Semitism was coined in the 1870s by Wilhelm Marr as a euphemism for Judenhass, or Jew hatred, and that has remained, as you all know, the accepted term for hostility or prejudice against Jews. And yet, we see at the UN that at the Durban conference, the NGO Forum passed the following declaration, which said, quote, "Anti-Arab racism is another form of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia." So this is repeated throughout the United Nations and pushed by the Islamic group in Arab countries. Why do they make this absurd argument that anti-Semitism is against Arabs and Muslims? Well, it's not that complicated. Amir Rushdie, an Egyptian diplomat in 2002, rejected accusations of anti-Semitism in Egypt, and he said, because, quote, "The Egyptians were more Semitic than the Israelis, having lived in their country for 7,000 years. And then he said the following year at the Human Rights Commission, quote, "No one could accuse Egyptians of being anti-Semitic, since that would be a contradiction in terms." So absurd as this argument is, its function is clear. It's meant to be a shield for Arab states or Islamic states whenever they're accused of anti-Semitism. Say it's impossible. We're Semites, and we're the victims of anti-Semitism. How could we possibly commit anti-Semitism? And, at the UN, those who make this argument may or may not believe it, but there are many ambassadors from other countries who don't know very much about anti-Semitism, and these sort of silly plays on words may actually resonate among them. Or at best, maybe to sow confusion, so that whenever the UN does condemn anti-Semitism, the Arab and Islamic states can say, well, actually, it's about us. And there is sort of, as we see oftentimes at the UN, this odd contradiction whereby 10 NGOs wrote to complain to the chair of the Islamic Conference, and he just wrote back, and he insisted that, he said, you, the 10 NGOs, including UN Watch, you have your interpretation of anti-Semitism, and we have our very legitimate claim. And what it seems like what they do is, on the one hand, these same states that fight against any reference at all to anti-Semitism are the same ones who say they're the victims of anti-Semitism. You think that if they were the victims of it, they would want to reference it. So it's a contradiction in terms, and yet this is a long-standing campaign at the UN, and it's pernicious. It's a pernicious obstacle in the effort to fight anti-Semitism. If you can't name the hatred, how can you possibly recognize it and fight it? So that's obstruction in the campaign against anti-Semitism. And finally, we come to the UN's role possible role in contributing to anti-Semitism. So not fighting anti-Semitism, not inaction, not obstruction of the fight, but actually contributing to anti-Semitism. And here we come to the issue of Israel, a very controversial and heated subject. Is criticism of Israeli government actions or policies anti-Semitism? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Israel must be held accountable, it must be scrutinized. Its government action, its policies must be open to criticism by anyone, including the United Nations. The United Nations is obliged to hold Israel accountable like every other state. At the same time, it is clear, as Kofi Annan said, that sometimes there are times when criticism of Israel, legitimate criticism of Israel, becomes something else, and it crosses over into something entirely illegitimate and demonization of Israel and of the Jewish people as a collectivity, using Israel as a mask. Kofi Annan said in January 2004 that, quote, "No one should be allowed to use criticism of Israel's actions as a mask for anti-Semitism." And here he was speaking about intent, the intent of those who try to mask their intent. But of course, one could also, and I think for our purposes, just look at the effect. What is the effect of these UN resolutions? And in our report, on page 42, we look at leading authorities who address this issue. And this issue is clearly controversial, but it has been addressed by leading authorities. And I'll just cite briefly the EU's own definition, and then examine the UN's record. According to the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, formerly known as the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, the EUMC, in a 2004 analysis on anti-Semitism, they provide a working definition, and they provide that anti-Semitism can manifest itself with regard to Israel in the following examples. One, when the Jewish people are denied their right to self-determination. For example, claiming that the existence of Israel is, in its essence, a racist endeavor. Second, when one applies double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Third, when symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, such as claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, are used to characterize Israel or Israelis. And finally, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. All of these are indicators where criticism of Israel may in fact constitute anti-Semitism. Other leading authorities address this issue, including Walter Laqueur, Nathan Sharansky, former Israeli cabinet minister, and Soviet prisoner of conscience, has a 3D test where he looks at demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. All of these, I think, have a common thread. They seek to address resolutions or other pronouncements that are fundamentally irrational, that do not seek to actually promote human rights, but seek to really just demonize Israel. And so the question is, looking at the UN's record in the past 3 years, how does it measure up in potentially contributing to anti-Semitism? What I'd like to do, and what we do in our report, is just examine case studies of 2 UN bodies. One is the General Assembly, and one is the Human Rights Council, and just to look at the past year, so 2006, 2007, of both bodies, how they treat Israel as case studies. And just by way of background, just for a moment, to give some background on this issue, in 1975, as Anand had mentioned, the UN passed a resolution called Zionism is Racism. It was initiated by the Arab states together with the Soviet Union. It was adopted by a broad majority, although many democracies opposed it. Eventually, this pernicious text was repealed. The intent of that resolution was to strip Israel of its legitimacy after the Holocaust in the post-war world. Racism is the enemy of mankind, rightfully so, and if a government, if a country is fundamentally racist, it has no right to exist, it is not legitimate. That was the intention of this campaign. That resolution was repealed, but regrettably, at the United Nations, there remains very much an infrastructure where the spirit of Zionism as racism lives. And it lives in a series of UN committees and reports and resolutions that together form an infrastructure that demonize and delegitimize the state of Israel. And if we look at just the past year, 2006, 2007, you will find that in the General Assembly, the premium voice of world opinion of the United Nations, only a handful of governments and countries were singled out for censure. Only a handful of countries. So for one resolution each, Uzbekistan, Iran, North Korea, and so forth, just a handful of countries. Israel was singled out for 22 resolutions. So a handful of countries won each, and then Israel had 22 resolutions. This has an effect. The international forum, the world's premier forum of international law, condemns one country, one nation, 22 times in one-sided resolutions. All these resolutions are entirely one-sided. They make no reference whatsoever to Islamic Jihad, to Hamas, to Hezbollah, not at all. These one-sided resolutions add up and contribute to this infrastructure of demonization. That's at the General Assembly. And in our report, there is the most thorough analysis of each one of these resolutions. It's appendices to our report on pages, we found on pages 53 of our report. And it looks at each resolution, who initiates these resolutions, and inevitably they're almost entirely introduced by the Islamic states, or by countries like Cuba. And there we provide a summary and analysis explaining why these are one-sided, and they're fairly obvious. These are one-sided resolutions. Even worse, regrettably, is the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council, based in Geneva, Switzerland, the highest intergovernmental human rights body, was reformed. It used to be called the Commission on Human Rights. The Commission on Human Rights used to single out Israel in 50% of its resolutions. That body was reformed in June 2006. A new body emerged called the Human Rights Council. It was supposed to be better. In the first year since its inauguration, what has happened to the Human Rights Council? The number went up to 100%. In the first year of the Human Rights Council, 100% of its condemnations against countries were against Israel. Not a single other country, 191 member states, was referenced once. No other country was condemned once. Sudan was addressed, more reports were asked, there was no condemnation, and in fact Sudan was even praised, and I'm quoting, for its cooperation. Israel was condemned by the Human Rights Council in 100% of its resolutions. If that is not demonization, I don't know what is. These resolutions, again, were entirely one-sided. When Hamas attacked Israel and kidnapped the serviceman Gilad Shalit, Israel responded. Israel was condemned in a resolution, an emergency session. No mention whatsoever of Hamas. When Hezbollah attacked Israel in the summer of 2006, Israel responded to the same resolution, emergency session, accusing Israel of war crimes. Not a word mentioning Hezbollah's attack. Many European governments that sometimes abstained voted no on these resolutions. They were that pernicious. And even human rights groups, which frequently criticize Israel, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, condemn these resolutions as biased. So for an entire year, first year of its new manifestation, the Human Rights Council condemned Israel alone. This is Israel not as the worst violator, not only as the worst violator of human rights in the world, but as the only violator of human rights in the world. Nothing about Saudi Arabia, China, Sudan, and so forth. So that is what we see at the Human Rights Council. And my friends, I'll just give you one anecdote, and I have to wrap up soon. When I sit there at the Human Rights Council as the Executive Director of UN Watch in Geneva with my colleagues, and I was sitting there last year at these sessions, and two things struck me, two moments of the fundamental irrationality of it all. And I'll just share with you two anecdotes. One of them is when, a few months ago, I was sitting in a session, and I was sitting there with my laptop, and there were two realities. There was the reality of the debates at the UN Human Rights Council, and I'm reading on my laptop of what's happening in the region, what's actually happening, and the two could not be further apart. This was a few months ago when Hamas and Fatah were engaged in a civil war, and they were killing each other. Dozens and dozens of people were being executed. Israel was not involved at all. Israel really took a step back and had no presence whatsoever in any of this. Hamas took over Gaza and remains in control of Gaza. And during this time, I'm reading on my computer screen what was happening live, that people were being pushed off rooftops in the Gaza Strip, pushed off rooftops. Hamas was going into hospital beds where the injured, the wounded lay of competing groups, and was shooting them in the hospital beds, including in Beit Hanun, and walking around and shooting people as they lay wounded in hospital beds. And at Islamic and other universities and religious schools were being firebombed and people were being shot. All this was happening and was being reported in all the newspapers. And I'm looking at it on my laptop, And yet, in the Human Rights Council itself, you were just hearing condemnations of Israel. And the hearing things, I'll just give you a few quotes of the kinds of things that one was hearing. One was hearing quotes like, from the Palestinian Observer, quote, "The Holocaust is going on, and it is an Israeli Holocaust against Palestinian people." I was hearing quotes like, from the Iranian delegate, quote, "There is an Israeli Holocaust against Palestinian people on a daily basis for more than 60 years. I was hearing quotes from the Syrian delegate, which fundamentally dehumanizing Israelis, saying that civilians, I'm quoting now, "Civilian people were killed, massacred by the invading forces who have come from the planet Mars," which they now call the Israeli occupier. These were the kinds of quotes that one was hearing in the Human Rights Council. I'm looking at my laptop, and Hamas and Fatah are throwing each other off rooftops and shooting people in hospital beds and so forth. And not a word of it was mentioned in the Human Rights Council. So the irrationality of it was so striking to me. Just one other example. Something quite remarkable. One of Israel's harshest critics, and who really contributes to the demonization of Israel, is a man named John Dugard. He's the UN expert on Palestine. His mandate is only to review Israeli actions which are presumed violations. It's the only mandate of its kind of the Human Rights Council that addresses only one side of the dispute, and the only one that presumes the actions in question to be violations. This is John Dugard, and he relishes the mandate, and he says it's fair. So he is one of the strongest critics of the UN of Israel, and yet, this summer, he wrote a report, very interesting, and he said, you know, as UN expert on Palestine, I asked the Human Rights Council a couple of times not to send me on these missions, because it made no sense, because it was already a year past. The issues that were addressed by these resolutions had already been made moot by circumstances. He said, I already went on a mission, a general mission, which covered these issues, and yet the Human Rights Council was adopting one resolution after another, talking about a fact-finding mission from 6 months ago, from a year ago, and they continue to pass these resolutions, and he said it's entirely moot. And he said, I urged the Human Rights Council not to waste their time doing these resolutions, and in fact, they're only hurting my mandate, and that Israel allows him to go, he said, to Gaza and to the West Bank, but these resolutions only hurt him, and yet he was ignored. And he said, and yet I was ignored. So here is the UN expert on Palestine saying that these resolutions are either moot, irrelevant, unhelpful, and no one cared. The campaign is to condemn Israel one time after another, and the objective is not how to help Palestinians, and certainly not how to help Israelis, but not either how to help Palestinians. And you know, Amnesty International on this issue, and we'll just wrap up in a minute, Amnesty International released a report a month ago about Palestinians whose human rights are being violated. And you'll be very shocked that this has never been referenced, this issue, by any UN division on Palestine. There are many committees and divisions. Why is that? Because Israel is not involved. This is, it's about Palestinians living in Lebanon. There are some hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Lebanon. They are denied the right to work. They're denied the right to leave their areas. And Amnesty International wrote a report about this, a 31-page report. It has never been referenced as Palestinian rights, never been referenced in any UN committee or resolution on Palestinian issues. If these resolutions were, as they proclaim to be, truly to help Palestinians, they would mention these issues, and they don't. It's a euphemism for the demonization of Israel. So when we look at the past 3 years, we actually see an intensification from 18 resolutions went at the G8 to 22, at the Human Rights Council from 50% to 100%. So regrettably, when we come back to Kofi Annan, we talked about the low point of 1975, of Zionism as racism, and talk about how UN resolutions contribute to this issue. Regrettably, we see regression. And I just want to quote something from Kofi Annan, which is worth quoting, and to wrap up. Kofi Annan asked, he asked if all these resolutions do anything. And he said that, in fact, they do nothing but give the impression of, quote, bias and one-sidedness. And to some, noted Annan, quote, it sometimes seems the United Nations serves the interest of all the world's peoples but one, the Jews. And yet, regrettably, on this issue, he was ignored. Now, the one final issue I need to mention is what happens with these resolutions. As I said, they become perceived as expressions of world opinion. Some diplomats in New York, at the General Assembly and in Geneva will say, we support these resolutions because realpolitik. We want to give the Arab states something for national interest, but fundamentally, who really cares? These don't really matter. But they know that they matter, and they do. And, we looked at, this report does this for the first time that's ever been done to my knowledge, on page 48 of our report. We actually opened up what happens with these resolutions. And did you know that in the Middle East, in Iran and in Syria and in Palestinian areas, the moment these resolutions are adopted, they are trumpeted by all of these extremists? Did you know that Iran's Ayatollah Rafsanjani dedicated half of his Al-Quds Day mass rally when they chant death to Israel this was in 2006, last year, to UN resolutions saying that Israel is violating international legitimacy. And I want to give you one quote of how these resolutions are used in state propaganda. Syria's state media, when one of these resolutions was adopted, they immediately rushed to press to tell the Syrian people, and I quote, this is the Syrian government telling its people, quote, "This reflected Israel's isolation and proved that our causes are just and enjoying broad international support." So when these resolutions are adopted, the extremists in the region, Iran, Syria, Islamic Jihad, we have a quote here in the report, immediately take these and say, the world is with us. These resolutions are not meaningless, they are pernicious. Folks, to wrap up, it's been 3 years since Kofi Annan's call to action. We have seen some noteworthy advances in Holocaust commemoration, combating Holocaust denial. We've also regrettably seen some mixed record. We've seen inaction, we've seen obstruction, an attempt to redefine anti-Semitism, to define it away, and regrettably, we have seen the demonization of Israel, which, at least in its effect, is contributing to anti-Semitism. Our report calls on the United Nations to live up to its promise. Thank you very much.
So, Hillel's agreed to take some questions and answers, answer the question period. And I'll start off, first of all, I want to thank Hillel for this presentation and also for launching the report today with us. It's a very important report, and I think it's a report that appears to be, or tries to be balanced. So this is my critical question. There's something to me, for whatever it's worth, quite pathetic in the sense that it's taken the United Nations 65 odd years to speak out loudly and clearly about the Holocaust and the tragedies of the Holocaust. And it should never be minimized at all. And it is an advance at some level. But there's something pathetic about condemning a genocide that took place 65 odd years ago when member states, states that are in charge of human rights affairs and that sort of thing, and committees of the United Nations, are actually engaged in spreading, or at least inciting, the notion of genocide, the wiping out of Israel, the killing of Jews. Organizations like Hamas, Palestinian organizations, Lebanese organizations, Iranian organizations, and others literally, clearly call for the annihilation of Jews and their materials. So my question is, how, as an NGO, challenging, how do you develop an action plan? Planning stages. How do you develop a plan to really confront, as you said, sprinkled throughout your talk, this pernicious form of genocidal anti-Semitism? Is there a way to develop a plan to enlist the support of rational actors and states to try and deal with this horrible scourge?
Thank you. I don't know that there is a magic solution, and clearly you raise a vital issue. We talked about the UN's positive contributions on addressing the Holocaust, and that's dead Jews. And we're all very sad about what happened to dead Jews. What about live Jews? What are you doing for them? And to be fair, Secretary General Annan and Ban Ki-moon, and even the Security Council, did condemn Ahmadinejad for, among other things, what was said against Israel, inciting genocide against Israel. It surely wasn't often enough. It was one or two statements, and we wish that that these statements would come every time Ahmadinejad says them. Each infraction deserves a response. Every public statement like that deserves a response, and so we haven't seen enough. But there has been some. So to be fair to the UN, and our report really tries to be fair to the UN. This is not something to paint in a broad brush. At the same time, there are member states, and the UN, regrettably the Human Rights Council, is reflecting the hatreds that prevail in certain member states. Regrettably, the Human Rights Council has become dominated by many of these states, supported by dictatorships from other regions of the world. So what is the action plan? I don't know what the solution is. I can tell you what we're trying to do, and the UN Watch works with a broad range of coalitions. You saw that, speaking on Holocaust denial, a range of religious groups from around the world. Our letter to the chair of the Islamic Conference from a few weeks ago was signed by actually an organization from Pakistan and many others, and Christian groups and church groups and women's coalitions. So there are many groups that care about this issue. It's not an isolated issue. And the best that we can do is try to win over the well-intentioned. We're not going to win over Iran or Syria and regrettably other Middle Eastern states that are quote-unquote moderate. Unfortunately, in this issue, they've been harmful. But one would like to win over at least the democracies, and it's not always the case. Regrettably, on these issues, a great democracy like South Africa and India votes for every Islamic resolution, no matter how one-sided, for their own realpolitik or whatever the reason, they vote for every resolution. Regrettably, the Latin American countries, almost every resolution of these 10 resolutions condemning Israel, all one-sided. The Latin American countries, almost to a fault, voted for every single one. Switzerland has voted against some, abstained on others, voted yes on others. So regrettably, even democracies, for a range of reasons, do not see eye to eye with NGOs such as ours on these issues, and that's deeply regrettable. We take heart that Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon have condemned the Human Rights Council in diplomatic terms. When the Human Rights Council instituted an item on the agenda for the permanent indictment of Israel in June 2007, and it's about to go before the General Assembly next week, and they'll either confirm it or overturn it, and 99.99% they're going to confirm it. It's the permanent indictment of Israel on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. Ban Ki-moon spoke out against it, and when we, UN Watch, referenced that and quoted him, the Egyptian ambassador rose to the floor and said, that's not what Ban Ki-moon said, but of course it is what he said, and in fact the Islamic group condemned him a month later. He said it in June 20th, 2007, a month later at the Human Rights Council. The Islamic group and Egypt got very upset. So when UN officials speak out, their words resonate. And so the best that we can do is try to reach out to UN officials who are well-intentioned and get them to use their moral power the best that they can, and to reach out to democracies, some of whom have spoken out, but clearly not enough. And we hope that they will pay heed to our report. Our report will be sent to all 192 governments, and we hope that they'll pay greater attention to these issues.
And just to follow up very quickly, there's a bit of a movement developing in Canada and Australia and actually in the United States Congress. The 1948 Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, Article 3 stipulates that incitement to genocide contravenes the convention, and that people, individuals or regimes engaged in incitement to genocide ought to be brought to trial. Is that a plan of action that UN Watch or other organizations give any credit to or credibility? Is this a possibility to pursue?
Well, I think it's perfectly appropriate and correct. The Genocide Convention is very clear about incitement to genocide, and President Ahmadinejad could not be more clear, saying time and again to wipe Israel off the map. With the conjunction of this race for nuclear weapons and parading Shihab missiles on the streets of Tehran, which say death to Israel. So there's really no secret here about what his intentions are, and I don't think anyone could claim that they didn't know in advance. And so from a legal perspective, and I used to be a lawyer and I still pay my dues to the New York State Bar, so from a legal perspective, and the Yale lawyers can correct me, I think it's a pretty open and shut case. The question is this going to go anywhere, and so forth. I don't know that it's really going to go anywhere. Member states don't want to take this on, but I think the point needs to be made. And UN Watch supports that we haven't ourselves been involved in organizations that have been, and we support their efforts, and clearly this point should be made. And if a member state, such as Canada, I know that Professor Hillel is trying to get to Canada, there's a parliamentary committee that has raised this issue in Canada. We hope that governments would pick it up, absolutely.
To go for a second, did you not commit a self-inflicted wound in first saying that it was worthy that you were then articulating all the problems that you did?
I think there's a lot. There's a.
As I understood you began by saying that there is a worthiness in having you win, but then again you enumerated time and time again all the problems associated with its forum for communicating anti-Semitic material. Without words of Joseph Goebbels, it's not tell the lie long enough or often enough, and people will believe it. Has the UN not just given audience to lies, more than it has given audience to truths, so that we have in fact maybe taken a step forward, but 2 steps backwards with regards to anti-Semitism? If you go back only a couple of years ago, after the siege of January was out, Saeed Erekat, one of the Palestinian representatives, got on TV and said that there was a massacre in which tens of thousands of Palestinians were killed. After UN acknowledged that I think the total in the end was 73 people following the genocide, he was interviewed again. And he said, what difference does it make? 73, 10,000, it was still a massacre. And that's all that people hear. And so, what is being accomplished by giving audience this type of rhetoric? Where do we benefit from that at all?
Well, I certainly agree with you that we don't benefit at all from any of this rhetoric. And in fact, I was doing some research. There was a conference held in 1986 about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, looking at the Zionism's racism resolution. One of the papers was a member of the U.S. Subcommission on Human Rights, not a Jew, but he was talking about his own experience being a member of this UN subcommission and hearing so many anti-Semitic remarks, and he said that oftentimes the presiding officer in other member states would say nothing. And regarding the issue, that he wrote this article in 1986 and is still with us today. So clearly all of their statements are not beneficial at all, they are pernicious, and they promote anti-Semitism, and they're terrible. The question is, to what extent do we judge the UN as a whole with it? The UN is complex. It's, we, UN Watch, support the UN's founding principles. We support the role of the UN. We believe the UN has a unique role in today's world. It's an institution that can do so many things that no one else can. That said, we're also one of the leading organizations in the world, I'd say the foremost organization, fighting anti-Semitism as well as promoting human rights for all. So how do we square the two? Well, the UN is a vital institution, and yet it very often falls short, and there's no way around it. The UN is not going anywhere. Even if we didn't like the UN and thought it was all nonsense, and it's not. There are many good things that the UN does on a whole range of issues, whether it's World Health, refugees, and many things. Even if one thought the UN was all bad, it's not going away. Some people in America might wish it away. It's not going away. It's there, and there will always be an international institution of its kind. And so ultimately, we have to deal with this forum as it exists. And if it weren't the UN, it would be another forum. You know, these similar things were raised when the Red Cross meets, when the International Year of the Woman met in 1974. They said Zionism is racist and so forth. So it's something that one has to. It's not a simple thing to be there at the UN to hear all these things, and yet to believe in the UN as an institution. It's certainly challenging. We continue to do so, and yet we try to make it better by building coalitions with governments and officials. And there's no simplistic solution to this. And the terrible things we see at the UN reflect hatreds that exist in the world, reflect the tyranny that exists in the world. In some ways, I think personally, I found it beneficial for me, as someone who lived in Canada and Switzerland and the United States and other countries, always in democracies. And I never lived in a tyranny. I don't know what they think. You sit at the UN, you know what they think. They tell you. And it's actually very instructive. And you know that in these countries, they're telling people that anti-Semitism is not against Jews, or perhaps believe that the protocols of the Elders of Zion is something that's real. And so, in that sense, what I mean to say is it reflects deeper problems. The UN is not necessarily the source of the problem, but clearly, when forums like these are subverted, the Human Rights Council votes 100% of its resolutions to condemn Israel, it raises questions about its credibility, very deep questions about its credibility. And we just have to speak out against it. It's not going away. The U.S., take the Human Rights Council as an example, the U.S. Decided not to run for a seat. Is that the right approach? Those who supported this approach said, how could we add credibility and legitimacy to an institution that has completely failed, not only in Israel, but that has failed on the full range of human rights issues? And I understand and respect that approach. The question is it making a difference? Well, the U.S. is not a member, they're just an observer, and they're kind of stepping back even further from being an observer. And is it making a difference? Well, it's going on. The U.S. is not the only country in the world, and it's far less significant than it used to be. The Europeans believe in this institution, and they're there, and this body goes on, and it says what it says. And our approach actually is the best thing probably would be for the U.S. to be in there, and perhaps to take the approach of Senator Moynihan, who in 1975 was the U.S. ambassador to the General Assembly. And when it adopted Zionism as racism, he said, the United States rises to declare that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. I would like Ambassador Moynihan to be back at the Human Rights Council, but he's not. Well, let me just President, there is an American ambassador who is there and does speak out, and we very much appreciate the work that he does in America. It is outspoken, but what I mean to say is, I think perhaps in these issues, the best way to do it is to confront the evils instead of walking away. Sometimes walking away is important, but from a permanent forum may not be the answer. Sorry, I don't hear people.
Maybe your last answer makes this question moot, but I was just wondering that as Western democracies provide the vast majority of monetary funding to the UN, countries like the US and Canada and France and Germany, what does the UN Watch think about a monetary compulsion to equal opportunity human rights within the UNCHR?
I'm not trying to say, what do you mean by monetary compulsion? You mean like withholding funds if they don't behave properly?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is something that has been attempted at times. Actually, it's happening now. There's an initiative in Congress, and I forget exactly where it's at. I believe the House already passed an initiative. I don't know if it's yet become law, but it seems like it had bipartisan support and so forth to do exactly that, to withhold funds, withhold U.S. contributions to the Human Rights Council. And is this a good idea? What does UN Watch think about it? Well, I think that at times the U.S. contribution, which is 22% of the budget, is important leverage. And I'm speaking personally, not from my organization. We haven't come up with a policy statement on it, so I'll just speak personally. Personally, I think there may be times when the leverage that the U.S. or other governments have with their money, with taxpayer money, can be used, and it can get the UN's attention. And I think it has a role to play. But you can't overdo